I'm Catherine Kennedy from the Institute's Professional Standards team, and today I'm talking about risk issues for practice, particularly in relation to the new standard APES 325, Risk Management for Firms, which comes into effect on the 1st of January 2013. Now, APES 325 is not the first professional standard to deal with risk issues. In your practices, you already have professional indemnity insurance and you prepare engagement documents and you have a system of quality control in place. And the professional standards which set these requirements have primarily addressed engagement risks, so the risks of providing professional accounting services to your clients. However, the Accounting Professional and Ethical Standards Board, which has responsibility for developing the professional and ethical standards for the three accounting bodies, recognised that in this volatile environment, there's a broader range of risks than just engagement risks, which can impact the ability of practices to meet their objectives and to meet their public interest obligations. And also recognising that accountants and accounting firms aren't immune from the fallout from risk events. We've seen a number of fairly high-profile examples of that over recent years. So there are issues like business continuity and reputation, which can impact the ability of firms to meet their business objectives. And many of you will already have processes in place for addressing some of these broader risks. What this standard requires is that you formalise these processes. We believe that there is significant value that can be added to a practice by implementing an effective risk framework in the practice and integrating a risk culture and a risk awareness within the practice. The Institute will be providing tools to assist practices to meet the requirements of APES 325. Later in the year, probably around November, there should be some guidance available in an e-learning format that will provide training for you and for employees within the practice in relation to what's required to establish a risk management framework. So we'll go on to have a look at the requirements of APES 325. Broadly, APES 325 requires each firm to establish and maintain a risk management framework, taking into consideration its public interest obligations. And the standard sets out the components of this framework, which we'll have a look at shortly. Having established a risk management framework, the firm must then periodically evaluate its design and effectiveness, and this ensures that it's not a one-off exercise which can be filed away and forgotten. The intention is that it becomes integral to the firm's operations. The process has to also be documented, and we'll have a look at an example of a documented framework in a later slide. APES 325 sets out the components of the risk management framework, which include the policies and procedures to identify, assess and manage key organisational risks. So, the first step is to identify the key organisational risks for the practice within the context of the environment you operate in, your practice goals, and also taking into account your internal and external stakeholders, and those will be different for every practice. You then assess those risks and prioritise the mitigating strategies by considering the likelihood that the event will occur and then the likely consequences if the event did occur. Having done that, you then establish policies and procedures to reduce the chance that an identified risk will eventuate and to reduce the impact if it does. The standard identifies the key organisational risks that a practice has to consider. Now, practices are exposed to a range of risks which can impact operations and financial results, and some of those risks can even be serious enough to cause the failure of your business. Most people are aware of the most obvious risks that the practice is exposed to, but there might be other risks which can be overlooked or ignored. PwC did a recent survey of 200 businesses, each with a turnover of 200 million, and what they found was that although most of the businesses were aware of the risks that were presented to them, nearly half of them had no formal risk management plan in place. Now, it's very unlikely that if without a formal plan in place to address risks, they're going to be adequately addressed. So this standard addresses this by providing a list of the key organisational risk categories which have to be considered. So it's like a checklist. Not all of the risks will necessarily be relevant for every practice, and it's not necessarily an exhaustive list. There may be other risks that are relevant for your practice that aren't included there. But it is a useful list. It's a trigger to think about the range of possible scenarios which could impact the operations of the practice. Now we're going to have a look at what a risk table might look like. And this is a fairly simple example of a risk table. What I've done here is taken each of the key organisational risks that are set out in the standard and just come up with an example of one sample risk in each of those categories. So the first step is to identify the risks that are relevant for your practice, thinking about what can go wrong for the practice within each of those categories, what might prevent you from meeting your objectives. Having identified the risks, you then move on to assessing those risks. And the first step is to look at the likelihood that the risk event would occur in the practice. And I've used a risk table, a matrix, which you'll see in the following slide, which splits likelihood into 5 categories and goes from rare to almost certain. The next step in determining what the priority is for that particular risk is considering what the consequences will be for the practice. And again, looking at that risk matrix, the consequences in this go from insignificant to catastrophic. Now, each practice will have to determine what the limits are in each of those categories, because obviously a catastrophic event for a sole practitioner would be very different from a catastrophic event for perhaps a mid-tier or a large firm. So it's the impact on the practice and the way that it'll impact the objectives of the practice. And you can see in this risk table that you can have a situation where there's an event that's unlikely to occur, but the consequences, if it did occur, would be so catastrophic that it gives it a high priority. One of the examples in this is business continuity. You might not think that there's much likelihood that illness or an accident would disrupt the provision of services to clients, but in fact, if you're a sole practitioner, the consequences, if you did suddenly have an accident, would be pretty catastrophic for the practice. So having determined the priority rating for each of the risks that's been identified, you then have a look at developing the policies and procedures to address those risks. Now, risks can be avoided, so you might decide that you're not going to take up the offer of inexpensive office space on a floodplain. They can be transferred to somebody else, so you might do that by way of supplier agreements. They might be mitigated. Some actions taken or control procedures put in place to lessen the impact if the event occurred. Or you might decide that the risk is going to be accepted. So it may be that the impact of the risk is less significant than the cost of implementing the risk strategies. Now, in a lot of cases, you might already have controls in place to address some of the risks, and you should also identify strategies to deal with risks that remain after the controls have been put in place. For example, you might install fire doors and a sprinkler system, but you would probably also take out fire insurance to cover any damage to your office premises or equipment if there was a fire. Now, APES 325 also refers to ISO 31000 and Module 7 of the IFAC Guide to Practice Management for Small and Medium-Sized Practices. And both of these documents provide guidance in relation to implementing a risk management framework. Remembering always, though, that the type of framework that you put in place has to be relevant for the size and complexity of your practice. Now, the greatest value to the practice will be where the risk awareness becomes integral to the firm's operations. Now, that's unlikely to happen if you use a tick-the-box approach to compliance with the standard. An effective risk culture can influence decisions at all levels within the firm, even unconsciously. And it's in those situations that you're most likely to reap the benefits from implementing the requirements of the standard. But the standard supports practices in establishing an effective risk culture. And it says that responsibility for the risk management framework has to be taken by senior management of the firm. Now, this makes sense from a practical point of view because it will usually be the partners who are in the best position to identify and assess risks in a number of the key risk categories. But it's also critical to the firm's approach that the firm's approach to risk is set from the top, because this influences the culture of the whole firm. It's interesting to read the statement from Enron's Code of Ethics in relation to risk, and I'll just read you a bit of this. It says, "Employees are charged with conducting their business affairs in accordance with the highest ethical standards." Clearly there were some problems with Enron in terms of an effective risk culture being set from the top. And we all know what the consequences of that were. Now, whoever is given responsibility for elements of the risk management framework, whether it's partners or staff, the firm has to make sure that they have the necessary skills, experience, commitment and authority. For example, if responsibility for making sure that some of the control procedures are properly implemented is given to the receptionist, you have to make sure that she's got sufficient authority to hold the professional staff accountable for implementing those control procedures on a timely basis. And then there also has to be adequate communication of the risk management policies and procedures to all staff, with feedback encouraged. And in this way, it's more likely that staff will become fully engaged in the process and develop this risk awareness. And I think there's an interesting story about effective communication of risk policies and procedures with the World Trade Center evacuation. Apparently on September 11, 2001, 99% of the people who were located below the point of impact in the Twin Towers were safely evacuated. And the reason for that was that there had been a bombing in 1993. And after that bombing, the evacuation procedures were reviewed and they were effectively communicated, and there were regular evacuation drills. So when it came to that morning when the planes hit the Twin Towers, the people in those buildings knew what they had to do and they were able to do it quickly. So there was an impressive result, particularly considering that even disabled staff were safely evacuated from the buildings. So communication is key. APES 325 supports the implementation of the risk management framework being an ongoing process, a living document. And it's in this way that the risk awareness can become integral to the operational decision-making in the firms, and in this way firms will get the greatest value from implementing the requirements, because as awareness of risk is increased, it's more likely that opportunities for the practice will also be readily identified. So you'll not only have a better chance of meeting practice objectives and preventing negative events from occurring, but also recognising positive benefits for the practice. So the firm must establish a monitoring process to determine whether there are any new threats or opportunities which have arisen since the framework was first established, and to then have a look at the status of the risks that have been identified to make sure that there hasn't been any change in the status of those risks. There might be some that are no longer relevant, and again, there might be new risks which are more pressing. That monitoring also extends to making sure that the risk management policies and procedures continue to be relevant, adequate, and are operating effectively. Now, the standard doesn't specify how regularly the risk management framework has to be monitored. So this will be up to each practice to decide in terms of what's appropriate for your circumstances and how best you want to manage the process. It may be that you would choose to have a review of the risk management framework included as a standing agenda item for partners meetings at particular intervals. Now, the monitoring should also pick up instances of non-compliance with the risk management policies, and those instances of non-compliance have to be brought to the attention of the firm's leadership, the people who've taken responsibility for the risk management framework, so that appropriate corrective action can be taken. So there's no point having policies and procedures in place or documented in the framework if no attention's paid to whether or not those policies and procedures are actually being followed. The framework has to be documented, and the standard says that the documentation has to be retained for sufficient time to have compliance with the risk management framework evaluated or to comply with applicable legal or regulatory requirements for record retention. Then if we go back and review what we've looked at in relation to APES 325, we've talked about the standard and the fact that it's applicable from the 1st of January 2013, and the Institute is going to be providing some support material to assist with its implementation. The requirements of the standard, so the requirement to document and monitor policies and procedures that identify, assess and manage the key organisational risks with a view to establishing a risk culture within the practice, which is most likely to bring benefits to the practice and add value to the practice by ensuring that you meet your practice objectives, avoid the failure of the practice should a catastrophic risk event occur, but it'll also arm you with skills in relation to risk management, which you can use to provide services to your clients. The standard requires that senior management takes responsibility for the risk management framework, that it's adequately communicated to staff, and that anyone who is delegated with implementing elements of the risk management framework, have the necessary training and authority to fully undertake those tasks, and then that non-compliance is monitored. And through that process, by implementing this risk management framework, it should maximise the ability of practices to meet their practice objectives.